Welcome to the third module in our series on CA Gen training with GenStudio. Each of these modules picks up on where the last module ended, and so we are going to be continually developing and enhancing our sample application. If you've skipped any modules, you can download the model state for the start of each exercise or module from the IET website at iet.uk/studio developer and select the training tab, and there you will find the models as zip files for each of the training modules. In our last module we looked at local views, and we had an example of creating a local view called temp logon count of the work set IEF supplied and the count attribute, which we're using as a simple counter. In this module we're going to look at import and export views. Import views represent data that comes into the action diagram either from the user interface or from another procedure step via something called a dialog flow, which we'll cover in another module. Export views represent data that is leaving the program or procedure step, either to be sent back to the user interface or to be sent via dialog flow to a server module or another client module. So in our logon window we want a couple of fields which I'll add, one for the user ID, so I'm going to name this field user ID and put in a prompt of user ID and maybe position it here, and then another field for the password, so I'll call it password, and prompt is password, and because it's a password field I'm going to tick this property here to say that it's a password field. These fields both have an error marker against them, and that's because we haven't yet bound the field to an export attribute, because we need the export attribute to contain the value of the field data. So to do that I can switch to the Views tab, and I want to create an export view containing these two attributes. Previously I used the IEF supplied work set, but in this example I'm going to create a new work set. I'll give it a name like logon work, and then I'm going to add first a user ID attribute, and I'll allow my user IDs to be 8 characters long, and then a password attribute, and my passwords are going to be 100 characters long, but they could be mixed case, so I'm going to make them case sensitive. So there's my logon work set with 2 attributes. So now I can select exports, select add entity or work view, and in most cases you need some form of naming standard for your views. So in this application our export views are going to be called out, and then the work set that I want is logon work, and I want both of those attributes. So there's my export view, and so what I can do is bind this field to that export view, and I can do that here, or I can do it from the binding tab by picking the field and dragging it onto picking the attribute, dragging it onto the field that I want to bind it to. So my user ID is bound to the user ID field, and my password attribute is bound to my password field. I may also want to add some literal text here, for example, to give the user idea of what they have to do. and then I'll just auto size that and move it around a bit, make the field a bit bigger, window a bit bigger. What I also want to do is line up these, so the easiest way to do it is to pick this, and I want to horizontally align these two fields. So in the position tab here, I'm going to horizontally align that field with its prompt, and then I'm going to vertically stack separated by 5 pixels those fields, and then maybe I'll left align these two, make this a bit bigger and move this up to the top. Also, I want to get rid of some of this space here, but rather than doing that by adjusting the window size, we have a convenient auto size window function. And what I can also do, if I want to center that, I'll just center that control. So there's my window with the two fields added, and I'll save that. So what we have here is the export view, but you may recall that the data coming into the procedure step is not in the export view, it's in an import view. So what I need to do is, with Control-C, copy that export work view, paste it into the import view, and then what I need to specify is that export view is mapped to the import view. So I do that either here or in this mapping tab, where you can see if anything's unmapped or partially mapped. There's a warning triangle there which disappears when it's fully mapped. So essentially what happens is I've got my data in the export view and I'm mapping it to the import view, which means that when my procedure step executes, the import view contains a mapping or copy of the data that was in the export view. I may also want to change my message just so I can see what the value is. So I'm going to say hello space, and then I'm going to reference the user ID. We may also want to only allow the OK button to be pressed if the user ID and password have any data. So I can do that in one of two ways. I could disable that button through this disabling tab here when the user ID doesn't have data. So I can put that disabling in there, and possibly also when the password doesn't have data, so that would disable that. I could also add in some code here and put in a message box. Now I don't want to then go ahead and execute any further logic, so I could either put everything else inside an else clause, or I could do it another way with something called an escape statement, at which point I'll introduce a nice feature of the action diagrammer, which will be familiar to anyone who's used most other tools, and that's undo, but the standard CA Gen toolset doesn't have an undo capability. So if you're used to the standard Gen toolset and miss an undo capability, then you'll be very pleased to know that there is an undo which uses the standard Control-Z. So I've just undone those changes so that I can show you the escape. And we need to know where to escape, and we use the Alt and arrow keys to change this escape pointer to say where we want to escape to. So I'm going to use Alt and I'm going to make sure we escape the whole event action in that example. So that's my import and export views added, fields created and mapped to my imports, mapped to my exports, and my fields bound to the correct export view. So I can go ahead and generate that code. And test my application. So right now, no user ID and password, the OK button is disabled. And now there it is working. So remember at the end, when you finished, to save the model. So that concludes the module on import and export views. In a subsequent module, we'll be looking at further uses of these when we want to pass data from one action block to another. For now, we're just passing it between the window or user interface and the action diagram. So as some practice on what you've learned in this module, you may want to add some additional fields and some additional import and export views, and just practice adding those into your sample application. Thank you.